So Chris, it's awesome to get back together. Happy New Year, happy 2025, and January is upon us. And so welcome again to talk about forecasting in the manufacturing community. Again, for those that haven't been a part of the last one, we have Chris here with us from AMT. He shares his insights on trends, economic forecasts, and what lies ahead for the manufacturing community and the leaders in it. And so with that, I just want to take a moment and go back and just reaffirm for the manufacturing teams or the people that are looking at forecasting in general, like, why do you think forecasting matters?
Well, it's what I get paid to do, so that's the foremost reason for me. So forecasting is really interesting. It's basically trying to tell what the future brings. People have, been trying to do that for thousands of years, and basically all forecasting is guessing what's going to happen, but with a little bit of math behind it and looking at what past trends can kind of inform us about the future.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about this. Like, I always talk about forecasting as the holy grail for a business, because if people actually do forecasting well, whether it's sales connected to ops or whatever it is, all your decision making is impacted by it if you're doing it well. And so, yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that statement. So the question then is, I guess a follow-up on that is, so often when people look at forecasting, they're like, well, how accurate can it be? Is it the crystal ball? Am I doing like this and kind of throwing a number up? Like, can you speak a little bit to the reality of how accurate and predictable the forecasting can be? Because I think confidence is always fairly low when people start looking at their forecasts.
Absolutely. And I think it was at our MT forecast meeting back in October, somebody made the joke. They're like, oh, here's my forecast. It's going to be wrong. They're all wrong. But if you just look at one particular spot forecast of saying, this series is going to be up X% next year. Yeah, that's probably going to be wrong. What you really have to look at is the confidence intervals and the probabilities behind it. So as long as you're preparing for what the most likely scenarios could be, and then also recognizing what factors could change that, what'll push it toward the upside, what'll push it toward the downside, and constantly reassess as new data comes in where you think things are heading. I think that's the best path to have the most accurate forecasts.
Well, and it gives you vector. I mean, in the end, you're like, are we going into a 10% down economy? Are we going to a 20% up economy? Am I doing the opposite of what I should be doing because I'm lagging in the wrong way? I mean, so, there's that strength there. I guess one other thing that I would just close on this topic is, people talk about, yes, it's going to be wrong, but that accuracy number, I think, becomes a discussion point. So even if today we're looking at what the 2025, let's say, targets are, using historics, obviously you can have a pandemic or something that might throw all of that completely out of whack. I get that. But in general, when you're looking at, let's say, the next 12 months, is there kind of a reasonably right kind of where the forecasting sits today? It might move a couple months one way or the other, but in generalities, you're like, yep, reasonably right on some percentage of where I was going to be.
I would say it really matters on the confidence intervals more than the actual accuracy. So the narrower your confidence intervals are, the more faith you can put in that range. So, if I give you a forecast of plus 10%, but, it could be plus or minus 10% from there. So it could be anywhere from 0 to 20% growth. You're not really going to know what to do with that number. But if I say plus 10%, plus or minus 2, 8 to 12 is a much narrower field. And you can actually get to work and start planning based on that range rather than kind of throwing a dart at a board.
Okay, that's helpful. I think that's going to be really helpful. So let's jump in, unless there's anything else on forecasting in general.
It's been around for a while, so I don't think I'm going to put out anything new today.
Sounds good. So let's go into the current landscape. So we talked, 90 days ago, we talked about where manufacturing was. We talked about last year was a down year for most manufacturing as the industry as a whole. It started like in August, it was maybe down 10 to 11%. It was going to end the year at maybe a 6 to 8 or some other percent down for the year. What's the status update when you look at the forecast for manufacturing? And maybe if you have any of the data, how did we finish in 24 and what do you see going forward?
Absolutely. So, looking specifically at manufacturing technology, which is what we kind of focus on the most. So, the metal cutting, forming equipment, things like that. We are looking to be down about moderate single digits from 23 to 24, which is really reliant on a strong second half of the year. The first half of the year was down pretty healthy double digits. So, it really rebounded in the second half of the year. Now, as of MT Forecast, we were looking at several different projections that put growth in 2025 at potentially upwards of 20%. We have a webinar coming up at the end of the month on January 24th. You can register for that at amtonline.org. We'll have Oxford Economics there presenting their updated forecast. At MT Forecast, they were right around the 20% mark. Which, again, I said this in our last conversation, I rolled my eyes at when I first heard it. But the more and more I look into the numbers and look at the business conditions in the manufacturing sector, it seems like a really achievable goal for new orders.
So going back to our earlier conversation today, you talk about the range, right? Your confidence interval. Can you speak a little bit to the confidence interval at least at this point? Is there anything that you can help at this point?
So I don't have it for the previous forecast, but I'll definitely make sure that we look into it for our January 24th webinar.
Okay, cool. That's helpful. But again, it's probably not plus or minus 20, right? So
for sure.
Right. Let's call it reasonably right. You're probably,
you would hope.
Yeah, worst case, maybe even if it was plus or minus 10, it would still be up 10% for the year. And I think from trajectory standpoint, even if I just understood that from a manufacturing, preparing for capacity of being able to achieve the growth and not giving it to competition is probably a worthy discussion then internally as you're going through that process. Is that fair then, at least?
Absolutely. And I think one of the most compelling factors right now are if you look at capacity utilization in manufacturing and employment in manufacturing. Overall capacity utilization is somewhat flat, slightly trending downward. But if you look at some specific industries such as aerospace, I'm actually looking into the electrical equipment manufacturing sector right now, because there's all this buzz around data centers, things like that, reliability of the power grid. I say that as we have a couple inches of snow on the ground here in DC. So I think a lot of those industries are on upward trajectories with capacity utilization. Combine that with very flat employment levels for the last couple months in manufacturing. The only way to alleviate those capacity constraints and increase productivity is by adding technologies if you can't add additional workforce. And I think, a lot of people kind of look at that really quickly and say, well, yeah, if you're investing in all this new technology, of course you don't need new people. I think it's really the opposite. We hit that plateau of employment because there's only a finite number of people available. There's only a finite number of people that are trained. And adding that extra dimension of technology allows you to augment your current workforce when you can't add more.
I mean, it's a fair way to say it that if you don't figure out the technology piece, it's going to be really hard to grow.
Absolutely. And if you even look at what people are doing in factories now, it's not that people are losing their jobs because of automation or anything. Their jobs are better because of automation. I don't know if it's more of an indictment on me, but I've been in factories that are cleaner than my apartment. And I think a lot of that is because of the technology that's available right now. It's a cleaner, safer environment that people want to work in because of that technology.
We all appreciate it. It's good.
Absolutely, yeah.
So is there any technology changes since we talked 90 days ago that's, let's say, of note or that you think we need to be reminded of? Because, it's kind of like we all have amnesia. 90 days have passed. We've had Christmas, Thanksgiving, New Year, all those things, right? And it's like, Okay, with that being said, like, is there any other technology changes that we should be aware of or reminded of since we talked last?
Not that I can think of. The one, nothing like new breaking news, developing stories, but just to kind of reiterate what I was talking about last time, especially since I kind of touched upon the data centers, need for energy, things like that. Um, the reliance on advanced methods of either computing data, collecting data, or utilizing data in your manufacturing process will really either streamline operations or introduce new processes that we might never have thought of.
Yeah.
And I think that's really where the future's going. So having policies around collecting and utilizing data are going to be really, really critical going forward.
Okay. Is there any regional considerations when you think across the United States, Midwest, Southeast, Southwest? Like, are there any regional dynamics that you're seeing, or is it pretty consistent, both growth and opportunity, or is there dynamics regionally that you see at this point?
Right now, it seems pretty consistent regionally. I think
Okay.
when you do look regionally and see differences, it's not necessarily a geographic difference, it's what industries are concentrated where. So particularly in the Southeast, there's a lot of automotive that was going up in the last 2, 3 years. So they had a pretty good buying cycle of manufacturing technology and are, kind of starting to taper down now. The Midwest is a little bit of a weird one. They have a little bit of everything.
We're
So
weird. We're always just weird. It's
right,
cool.
they're generally the ones that buck the trend.
Yeah.
So that's the one I would say is a little bit independent, not necessarily associated with a specific industry. And
So it's much more broad in that respect, and then has enough of everything that it's kind of it's got it's good growth in general for 2025.
Exactly.
Okay. With that being said, talking specifically, if you're getting this opportunity to talk to, let's say, a president of a manufacturing company, CEO, whatever it is, specifically about what you're seeing in 25, is there anything that you think they need to be aware of or be doing at this point?
Mhm. Um, I would say the one thing that's probably most important is particularly with all the conversation around tariffs, different source country of origin issues. I would say evaluate your supply chains, see if your domestic suppliers can increase capacity if you need it. If not, try and find alternative sources. If tariffs are coming, back in 2017 with the steel and aluminum tariffs, there was a very lengthy exception process. So get started on that now. If there's a critical component that you're importing, get started on figuring out, is there a domestic supplier? Do they have the capacity to supply me? Answer all of these questions now so that if tariffs do come around the corner a little bit later, you have all that information prepared to file an exception with the U.S. Trade Representative's office.
That's a good point. Are there others that you're seeing come down the pipe at this point too?
I would say those are the two biggest issues.
Okay.
Everything else that could possibly be throw a wrench into our current path would likely be from government action. In our last conversation, I think I mentioned an article I spoke about, or an article I wrote a couple years ago about how narrow majorities in Congress are not great for business conditions.
Yeah.
And I think we all saw in last week with the speaker election that it's about as thin a majority as you can have. So I don't know if that bodes well for action getting done, or if it'll just introduce a thread of uncertainty again that we haven't had before. So I could see that one going either way.
Okay.
But again, I think the general economic conditions are going to far outweigh most of what Congress or the government can do.
So I can't really screw it up at this point. Okay.
Hopefully, knock on wood.
So just to reaffirm that from last time, for those that didn't see it, that the idea is that the more the Democrats and Republicans have a majority, one way or the other, it doesn't matter which way, usually the better it is for the manufacturing community. And the tighter, the slimmer of that majority, the less benefit it does to manufacturing. And I think the follow-up that was really insightful for me last time, it doesn't really matter what party is in the White House, as long as, that split within the Congress and with, Senate and House of Representatives is, the broader it is, the bigger that split is, the better it is typically for manufacturing. So that was a good insight for me last time. Is there anything else, if I'm an owner, specifically for an owner, I'm not, I'm thinking about maybe selling the business to other things, anything you want to say to 2025 if I'm putting on that ownership hat for a manufacturing company?
Yeah, I would say evaluating your supply chains are definitely going to be the most critical thing to do in 2025. Not only for possible tariff implications, but because of a lot of the massive reshoring that we saw the last couple years, there might actually be closer suppliers than you even realize. And as a lot of these different government projects that came on through either IRA chips or the Infrastructure Act, as they kind of start to mature and wind down, a lot of these shops that, were built up by them are going to start to have excess capacity, and you might be able to find a supplier a lot closer than you think.
Is that reshoring coming back to North America still on a high trend from what you're seeing?
It's definitely tapered down a bit.
Okay.
The industries that were ordering manufacturing technology that hadn't in a while are kind of generally going back toward their typical trends.
Okay.
But it still is a trend that we're seeing.
Okay. Anything else that you would like a leader to know that we haven't talked about?
Those are the big things that come to mind.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you again, Chris, for joining us. I appreciate your insights for manufacturing leaders and that really trying to figure out what to do in 25, especially with some of these last couple months where they might be feeling like it's not going in the right direction. I think it's helpful for them to hear the optimistic forecast. If they've got any additional questions, sounds like the January 24th is one great opportunity. You can reach out on AMT's website and do that. We'll try to provide a link for that as well. And then as far as closing, it's always good to stay on top of the forecasting, knowing where things are going to help you make better decisions. So I appreciate you taking the time today to equip those leaders in manufacturing companies. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me.